The crater had been quiet for 30 years, and everyone at Outpost Calder liked it that way. Rain fell in thin gray sheets over the burned valley, washing over rocks that were still black from an old war nobody wanted to talk about. Daniel Reyes walked along the ridge with a toolbox in one hand, checking a row of sensor poles that kept sliding out of position in the soft mud. He was not a scientist. He was not important. He fixed things that broke, and on most days, that was enough for him. The outpost behind him was a squat gray building sitting inside the dead crater like a scab. It was shared by 4 species who did not fully trust each other but had agreed, for the sake of research funding, to pretend they did. The Crevens clicked their mandibles when they spoke and kept to their side of the mess hall. The Solari needed tanks of water strapped to their backs when they walked on land and looked at everyone else like they were slightly insane for choosing to live dry. The Bathari were slow, gray-skinned, and almost never smiled, but they ran the station with quiet efficiency. And then there was Daniel, the only human tolerated more than welcomed. Nobody had expected to find anything alive in the crater. The valley had been a dragon nesting ground once, before the war that ended it. Scans over the decades had found bones, broken shells, scorched stone, nothing more. So when a survey drone flagged a shape buried under 3 meters of hardened ash 2 weeks ago, the science team assumed it was another fossil. It was not a fossil. Daniel had been there when they pulled it out of the ground. A smooth, dark egg, larger than a person's torso, warm to the touch even after decades in cold earth. The Bathari lead scientist, a stern figure named Grath, had gone pale gray at the sight of it, which for a Bathari was the same as turning white with shock. "This should not be possible," Grath had said. "Nothing survives that long." But it had survived, and now it sat inside a reinforced lab on the lower level, wrapped in warming blankets, monitored by cameras that never blinked. Daniel finished with the last sensor pole and turned back toward the station, rain dripping off his jacket. He didn't think much about the egg. It wasn't his department. He was more worried about the leaking pipe in Hydroponics Bay 2, which had been dripping onto a shelf of Solari kelp cultures for 3 days despite 2 separate repairs. He was still thinking about the pipe when the alarms started. They were not the usual maintenance alarms. These were sharp, urgent, 3 short blasts repeating over and over through every speaker in the station. Daniel dropped his toolbox and ran. By the time he reached the lower level, the corridor outside the egg lab was already full of people, and none of them were calm. A Creven researcher stood frozen near the door, antennae flat against her head, a posture Daniel had learned meant pure terror. 2 Solari technicians were backing away so fast one of them tripped over a coolant hose. Grath stood at the observation window, both hands pressed flat against the glass, staring inside. "What's happening?" Daniel asked, pushing through. "It is hatching," Grath said without turning around. His voice had lost all of its usual calm. "Get back. Everyone get back." Daniel looked through the glass. Inside the lab, the egg was rocking on its stand, thin cracks spreading across its dark shell like frost on a window. A soft, high sound came from inside it, muffled but unmistakably alive. "It's not attacking anyone," Daniel said. "It's just an egg." "You do not understand," Grath said. "You are human. You were not here for the war. That creature's ancestors burned 3 colonies to the ground before anyone could stop them. We do not know what we are dealing with. Get back, Reyes, that is an order." The other researchers were already retreating down the corridor, moving fast, some of them nearly running. Daniel hesitated. He had heard the old stories, the way everyone talked about dragons like they were living weapons, but stories were not the same as the small, scared sound coming from inside that shell. Before he could decide what to do, the station's automated systems made the decision for him. A containment protocol triggered somewhere in the building's core programming, and with a heavy mechanical groan, the blast doors on both ends of the corridor began sliding shut. "Wait," Daniel started. It was too late. The doors sealed with a deep thud that he felt in his chest. On the other side of the glass, he could hear Grath's voice shouting something about manual overrides, but the sound was muffled now, distant. Daniel turned around slowly. He was alone in the sealed corridor, and beyond the observation window, the egg was still cracking. He stepped closer to the glass instead of further away. He told himself it was because there was nowhere else to go. But some small part of him, the part that had never quite believed the old war stories were the whole truth, wanted to see what was inside that shell before anyone decided what it was supposed to be. The crack spread wider. A piece of shell fell away, and in the dim red emergency light of the lab, something small and silver began to push its way out into the world, completely alone, completely unafraid of the one person left in the room. Silence has a strange weight when something small and frightened is breathing on the other side of it. Daniel stood very still, watching the last piece of shell tip over and roll across the metal floor. What emerged from inside was nothing like the pictures he had seen in the station's old war archive. It was small, barely the size of a large dog, with damp silver scales that caught the red emergency light and folded wings pressed tight against a thin, shaking body. Its eyes were pale gold, wide open, and locked directly on him. Behind the observation glass, more people had gathered now, drawn by the alarms despite the sealed doors. Daniel could see them through the reinforced window, Grath with both hands still pressed to the glass, two armed Bathari security guards who had appeared from somewhere with weapons raised but not yet fired, and a cluster of Kreven and Solari staff pressed against the far wall like the room itself might catch fire. Nobody said a word about opening the doors. Nobody moved to help him. The hatchling let out a thin, cracked sound, somewhere between a chirp and a growl, and took one wobbly step forward on legs that clearly did not know yet how to hold her own weight. Daniel felt his pulse pounding in his throat. Every instinct told him to press himself against the wall, to make himself small, to do anything except stand in the open where a creature with a species-wide reputation for destruction could reach him. He didn't move. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the way her wings trembled, not with aggression but with something closer to fear. Maybe it was the fact that she had just been born into a world of blaring alarms, cold air, and strangers staring at her like she was already a weapon before she had taken a single full breath. Whatever the reason, Daniel slowly lowered himself down until he was sitting on the floor, making himself smaller instead of taller, and he kept his hands open and visible in his lap. "Hey," he said quietly. His voice sounded strange in the sealed room. "It's okay. Nobody's going to hurt you." He had no idea if she understood a single word. He said it anyway, mostly because the alternative was silence, and silence in that room felt dangerous. The hatchling's head tilted. She took another step, then another, her small clawed feet clicking softly against the floor. Somewhere behind the glass, one of the security guards shifted his weapon, and Grath raised a hand sharply to stop him from doing anything further. "Hold your position," Grath said through the intercom, though his voice was tight. "Raise, do not provoke it." "I'm not provoking anything," Daniel muttered. "I'm just sitting here." The hatchling crossed the last few feet between them in a small, uneven rush, and for one heart-stopping second Daniel thought she might lunge. Instead, she pressed herself against his leg, small and trembling, and let out a long breath that sounded almost like relief. She curled her body against him the way a frightened animal curls toward warmth, tucking her head under his arm, her thin wings folding down against her sides. Nobody behind the glass made a sound. For several long seconds, the only sound in the corridor was the hatchling's quick, uneven breathing. Daniel sat frozen, afraid to move in case it startled her, then slowly, carefully, let his hand rest against her back. Her scales were warm and slightly damp, still soft from the shell. She did not pull away. If anything, she pressed closer. "See," he said quietly, mostly to himself. "Not a weapon, just scared." Through the glass, Grath stared at the two of them with an expression Daniel had never seen on a Bathari face before, somewhere between disbelief and something that looked almost like shame. The security guards slowly lowered their weapons, though neither one looked fully convinced it was safe to do so. A young Kreven researcher near the back of the group let out a series of rapid clicks that Daniel guessed was some kind of shocked commentary. "She is not attacking," Grath said slowly, as if testing the words for the first time. "She sought him out." "Open the door," Daniel said. "She needs food, warmth, and probably a proper vet, not a sealed room full of people pointing guns at her." There was a long pause. Daniel could imagine the arguments happening on the other side of that glass, protocols being weighed against what everyone had just witnessed with their own eyes. Finally, Grath's voice came through again, quieter now. "The door will remain sealed. For now, both of you will stay under observation." A pause. "You are not in trouble, Rays. We simply do not know what we are looking at." Daniel looked down at the small silver shape curled against him, already drifting toward sleep despite the noise and the lights and the strangers watching from behind glass. Whatever she was, she did not feel like a weapon in his arms. She felt like something that had been born alone into a world that had already decided to be afraid of her, and had chosen, out of everyone in that station, to trust the one person who hadn't run. He didn't know it yet, but that choice was about to change everything at Outpost Calder. 3 days into quarantine, Daniel learned that dragons snored. It was a small, ridiculous detail, the kind of thing nobody had bothered to include in any of the old war records, and it made him laugh out loud the first time he heard it. A soft rumbling sound coming from the small silver shape curled up on a folded blanket in the corner of the sealed lab. The sound seemed to prove something to him, though he couldn't have explained exactly what. Monsters in old stories didn't snore. Scared, exhausted bobbies did. The lab had been converted into a temporary living space for both of them. A cot had been brought in for Daniel, along with basic supplies passed through a small sealed hatch in the door. Nobody had explained how long the observation period would last. Nobody had fully explained what they were observing, either, though Daniel had a good guess. They wanted to see if the hatchling would eventually turn on him. She hadn't. If anything, she had gotten more attached with every passing day, following him around the small room on unsteady legs, chirping when he left her side even to use the small attached washroom, and curling against him every night like he was the only warm thing in a very large and frightening universe. Daniel had started calling her Cinder, mostly because of the ash-colored crater she'd hatched in, and partly because the name had simply felt right the first time he said it out loud. The Science Council on the other side of the glass had not approved. "She should not be given a name," Grath had said during one of the daily check-ins, speaking through the intercom while a small camera drone hovered near the ceiling recording everything. "A name creates attachment. Attachment creates poor judgment. She is Specimen 1, and she should be referred to as such in all official reports." "She's not a specimen," Daniel had said. "She's a baby who just wants someone to sit near her while she eats." Grath had not responded to that, but he also hadn't argued further, which Daniel had begun to understand was as close to agreement as a Bathari was likely to offer. During the long, quiet hours of quarantine, Daniel had access to the station's archives, and out of boredom more than anything else, he started reading through the old records of the Dragon Wars, the ones every species at the outpost treated as settled fact. The official history was simple enough. Dragons had attacked early colony ships without provocation, burned 3 settlements to ash, and had been driven to near extinction in the resulting conflict. It was the story everyone told. It was the reason grown adults had backed away from a newly hatched creature, the size of a large dog. But the deeper Daniel dug, the messier the official story became. Buried in old survey logs and half-forgotten mission reports, he found records of early colonization teams that had landed directly on top of active dragon nesting grounds, mining operations that had disturbed egg sites decades before the first attack, and at least 2 incidents where colonial security forces had opened fire first, only for the details to be quietly left out of later summaries. The wars hadn't started because dragons attacked without reason. They'd started because someone had cornered a species defending its young, and then never bothered writing down that part. Daniel sat with that for a long time, Cinder asleep against his leg, her small chest rising and falling in slow, even breaths. "They wrote you as the villain before you even hatched," he said quietly, mostly to himself. "That's not really fair, is it?" Cinder stirred slightly at the sound of his voice but didn't wake. Daniel reached over and gently ran a hand along the ridge of her back, the way he might have calmed a nervous dog, and she settled again with a soft huff. On the 4th day, a new figure appeared at the observation window during the evening check-in, a Kreven researcher named Talia who had never spoken to Daniel directly before. She stood slightly apart from the others, antennae twitching with what looked like genuine curiosity rather than fear. "She reacts to your voice specifically," Talia said through the intercom, her translated words coming through slightly flat and mechanical. "Not to loud sounds in general. Loud alien voices still make her flinch. Yours do not." "Maybe she just likes me," Daniel said. "Perhaps," Talia said. "Or perhaps she has learned in a very short time who in this station is not a threat to her. That is not a small thing for a creature only a few days old." Daniel looked down at Cinder, still sleeping soundly despite the conversation happening a few feet away. He thought about the buried reports, the cornered nesting grounds, the wars that had started because fear had been allowed to make every decision. "She's not dangerous," he said. "She's just been born into a place that already decided to be afraid of her before she did anything at all." Talia didn't answer right away. On the other side of the glass, Grath said nothing either, but he didn't argue, and for the first time since the egg had hatched, Daniel let himself believe that maybe, slowly, some of them were starting to listen. The notice arrived on the 7th day, short and cold, sliding through the sealed hatch on a single printed page instead of the usual supply list. Daniel read it twice before the words fully settled. The station's governing council, made up of senior representatives from all 4 species, had scheduled an emergency session to determine the final disposition of Specimen 1. Daniel didn't need a translator to understand what that meant. Somewhere in the building above him, a group of people who had never spent a single night in the same room as Cinder were about to decide whether she lived or died. He was not invited to speak. Cinder, now noticeably larger than she had been a week ago, seemed to sense something was wrong before he even told her. She had taken to following the sound of his heartbeat, pressing close whenever his breathing changed, and that evening she stayed glued to his side, her golden eyes flicking toward the door every time footsteps passed outside. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you," Daniel told her, though he had no idea how he was supposed to keep that promise from inside a locked room. The council session was scheduled for the following morning, and Daniel spent most of the night awake, running through arguments in his head, none of which felt strong enough. He was a maintenance technician. He fixed leaking pipes and faulty sensors. He had no official standing to argue in front of a room full of senior scientists and species representatives about the fate of a creature his own species had never even properly studied. But he also knew that if he said nothing, nobody in that room would speak for her either. When morning came, he didn't wait for permission. He found the maintenance access panel he had installed himself 2 years earlier, the one meant for emergency repairs during containment lockdowns, and used his technician's override to unseal a side corridor that the automated systems hadn't accounted for. Cinder trotted close behind him, uneasy in the unfamiliar hallway, until they reached the heavy doors of the council chamber. Inside, the argument was already well underway. Grath stood near the center of the room, flanked by 2 other Bathari officials, addressing a wide table where representatives from each species sat in tense silence. A Solari elder spoke first as Daniel slipped inside, her translated voice slow and deliberate. 5 days of calm behavior does not undo generations of documented danger, she was saying. We would be foolish to base station safety on the good behavior of a single juvenile specimen. With respect, Grath said, in 5 days of close observation, she has shown no aggression toward any being except when directly threatened. Her only strong attachment is to technician rays, and her only fear responses have been directed at raised weapons and shouting. That is not the behavior pattern described in the War Archives. The War Archives may be incomplete, Daniel said, stepping fully into the room. Every head turned. A Bathari guard near the door moved to intercept him, but Grath raised a hand, stopping the guard before he could reach Daniel. This session is closed to non-council members, the Solari elder said sharply. I know, Daniel said, but you're about to decide whether to kill something that's never hurt anyone, based on a history that isn't even complete. I read the old survey logs. Your colonization teams built directly on top of active nesting grounds before the first attack ever happened. Someone opened fire first, more than once, and it never made it into the official reports everyone keeps quoting like scripture. The room went very still. A Kreven representative near the back let out a series of sharp clicks, clearly startled. That is a serious accusation, the Solari elder said. It's in your own archives, Daniel said. I didn't make it up. You built the story of dragons as monsters on top of a history you never bothered to finish reading. And now you're about to use that same unfinished story to decide whether a creature who was born 5 days ago deserves to exist. Cinder, who had been standing pressed against Daniel's leg through all of this, chose that exact moment to let out a small, worried chirp, drawing every eye in the room toward her small, trembling frame. For a long moment, nobody spoke. She is afraid, Grath said quietly, almost to himself. Not of us specifically, of everyone except him. Fear is not evidence of guilt, Daniel said. It's evidence that she knows exactly how this room feels about her before a single one of you has said a word to her directly. If you judge her only by the worst chapter of a history that isn't even fully true, she'll never get the chance to become anything else. The Solari elder exchanged a long look with the other council members. Nobody moved to end the session, which Daniel took as a small, fragile kind of progress. Finally, after a silence that felt like it stretched on far too long, the elder spoke again, her voice slightly less certain than before. The council will not vote on destruction today, she said. Instead, there will be a direct demonstration. Bring the specimen before the full council, unrestrained, and we will observe her behavior ourselves before any final decision is made. Daniel looked down at Cinder, who pressed harder against his leg as if she understood, on some instinctive level, that everything was about to be decided in a single moment. Okay, he said quietly, we can do that. He just hoped it would be enough. Nobody had bothered to warn Cinder that a room full of strangers was about to decide her entire future, and Daniel spent the walk to the demonstration chamber wishing there was some way to explain that to a creature who barely understood the word sit. The chamber itself had been cleared for the occasion, a wide, circular room usually used for large briefings, its center now empty except for a single mark on the floor where Cinder was meant to stand. Around the edges, the full council had gathered, along with additional security, armed and watching, and a scattering of station staff who had heard rumors and come to see for themselves. Grath stood near the front, his expression unreadable. The Solari elder from the day before sat at the center of the council table, flanked by representatives from every species on the outpost. Daniel felt Cinder's body go rigid the moment they stepped into the room. She had grown used to him, used to the quiet lab, used to the handful of faces that had become familiar over the past week. This was different. Too many strangers, too many raised weapons held at low ready, too much noise from too many directions at once. Her wings snapped open slightly, a defensive reflex, and a low sound rumbled in her throat that Daniel hadn't heard from her before. "Easy," he said quietly, crouching down beside her. "I know it's a lot, just stay with me." It didn't help much. As they moved further into the room, Cinder's steps grew more erratic, her head snapping toward every small movement, every clicking Kreven mandible, every shift of a Bathari guard's weight. When a security officer near the door adjusted his grip on his weapon, the small sound of metal against metal made her flinch so hard she nearly bolted for the exit, wings flaring, claws scraping against the floor as she scrambled backward. Several guards immediately raised their weapons higher, and the room filled with a tense, sharp energy that Daniel could feel pressing against his chest like a physical weight. "Hold your positions," Grath said sharply, but the damage was already done. Cinder was pressed low against the floor now, tail lashing, clearly deciding between fight and flight, and every instinct in the room seemed to be screaming the exact wrong thing at exactly the wrong moment. Daniel didn't think. He simply moved, stepping directly between Cinder and the nearest raised weapon, arms slightly out from his sides, hands empty, putting his own body in the space where a shot would have to pass through him first. "Nobody is going to hurt her," he said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "And she's not going to hurt anyone either. Just give her a second." The Solari elder half rose from her seat. "Raise, step aside, that is not a safe." "She's scared," Daniel said, cutting her off. "Look at her. That's fear, not aggression. If you point enough weapons at anything, it's going to look dangerous eventually. That doesn't mean it started that way." For a long, breathless moment, nobody moved. Daniel stayed exactly where he was, back straight, arms open, refusing to give the room any excuse to see him as a threat either. Slowly, carefully, he lowered himself down to one knee, keeping his eyes on Cinder rather than the council, and held out one hand toward her the way he had every single day since the egg first cracked open. "Come here," he said softly. "It's just me, it's okay." The room held its breath. Cinder's tail stopped lashing. Her wings, still half raised, trembled once, then folded slowly against her sides. She took one uncertain step toward him, then another, moving low to the ground until she crossed the last few feet and pressed herself hard against his chest, burying her head under his arm the exact same way she had on the very first night. A soft sound came from her throat, quieter than her usual chirps, almost a hum, and the station's translator drones, still recording everything, picked up something close to a single, broken syllable repeated twice. "Safe, safe." Nobody in the room said a word for several long seconds. Even the guards had lowered their weapons without seeming to notice they'd done it. Grath was the first to break the silence, stepping forward slowly, his voice quieter than Daniel had ever heard it. "In 5 days I have not seen her attack anything. I have seen her attack nothing even when directly threatened, in a room full of armed strangers, under conditions that would provoke almost any creature into violence. What she has shown, consistently, is fear, and one single point of trust." He turned to face the council table fully. "I move that we consider what that actually tells us, rather than what our history has already told us to assume." The Solari elder studied Daniel, and the small silver shape curled against him for a long moment before finally sitting back down. "Noted," she said slowly. "The council will deliberate." Near the back of the room, one older Kreven representative rose sharply from his seat, clicking something rapid and clearly furious to the translator drone hovering near him, then turned and stormed out through the side entrance without waiting for a response. The doors slammed shut behind him hard enough to echo. Daniel watched him go, a small, uneasy feeling settling in his chest that this wasn't quite as finished as it looked. But for now. In this room at this moment, Cinder was still breathing against his chest, calm and unharmed. And for the first time since the egg had cracked open, the fear in the room seemed to be losing. Word of the council's final decision spread through Outpost Calder faster than any official announcement could have managed. which was how Daniel found out he had won before anyone actually told him directly. The formal ruling came through 2 days after the demonstration, delivered in the same flat, official language as every other document the council produced, as if the words themselves hadn't just decided whether a living creature got to keep existing. Specimen 1, the notice read, would be granted provisional protection status under the direct guardianship of technician Daniel Reyes, subject to regular monitoring and quarterly review. The Kreven representative who had stormed out during the demonstration had filed a formal objection, a short, sharp document arguing that the council had let sentiment override sound judgment, and warning that this would not be the last time the issue was raised. Daniel read that part twice, filed it away in the back of his mind, and decided it was a problem for a future version of himself to deal with. For now, the doors of the lab were finally, fully unsealed, and Cinder was allowed to leave the small room that had been her entire world since the moment she hatched. She did not adjust quietly. The first time she wandered into the station's main corridor, a Solari technician nearly dropped an entire tray of water samples trying to get out of her way, and Cinder, startled by the sudden noise and movement, bolted straight back to Daniel's side with her wings flared and a worried chirp escaping her throat. Daniel crouched down, steadied her with a hand on her back, and reminded her, as he had 100 times already, that not every sudden noise was a threat. It took weeks, not days. Cinder grew steadily larger, strong enough now to knock Daniel off balance if she leaned into him too enthusiastically, her silver scales darkening slightly with age, her wings finally strong enough for short, clumsy flights across the station's larger open bays. She still flinched at loud alien voices sometimes, still pressed close to Daniel in unfamiliar rooms, but the flinching came less often, and the trust came a little more easily each time someone on the station took the time to move slowly and speak softly instead of reaching for a weapon. Talia, the Kreven researcher who had first noticed how selectively Cinder reacted to different voices, became a familiar visitor to the lab, patiently offering food by hand until Cinder learned to associate her clicking speech with safety rather than danger. Even Grath, stiff and formal as ever, began stopping by in the evenings, standing a respectful distance away, watching Cinder chase a maintenance drone across the floor with an expression that Daniel had started to recognize, on a Bathari face, as something close to fondness. It was not universal. The objection filed by the Kreven representative did not disappear, and Daniel knew, somewhere in the back of his mind, that there would be more council sessions, more arguments, more people who would never fully let go of the old fear no matter how many months passed without incident. But for the first time since the egg had cracked open in a sealed, red-lit room, that fear no longer felt like it was winning by default. On a quiet evening several weeks later, Daniel found himself sitting on the outpost's outer deck, a wide platform overlooking the old crater where Cinder had been born. The sky above the valley had cleared for once, streaked orange and gold with the setting sun, and Cinder lay stretched out beside him, large enough now that a single wing, draped loosely over his shoulders, was enough to block most of the evening wind. Footsteps approached from behind, careful and deliberate, and Daniel glanced back to see a young Kreven officer standing near the deck entrance, someone he recognized vaguely from the early days of the quarantine, one of the people who had backed away fastest when the egg first started cracking. "May I ask you something?" the officer said, her translated voice softer than Daniel remembered it being back then. "Sure," Daniel said. "That first night," she said, "when the doors sealed and everyone else left the corridor, you stayed. Why? You had every reason to be afraid, the same as the rest of us." Daniel thought about it for a moment, one hand resting absently against Cinder's warm side as she dozed beside him, her breathing slow and even in the cooling evening air. "I wasn't fearless," he said finally. "I was scared too, but she was more scared than I was, and she didn't have anyone else in that room who was going to stay. Seemed like a bad reason to leave someone alone just because leaving would have been easier. The Krevan officer considered that for a long moment, antennae shifting slightly, then nodded once and left without another word, disappearing back into the station. Daniel leaned back against the deck railing, watching the last light fade over the crater where a species everyone had assumed was gone forever had quietly started again, one small, stubborn act of trust at a time. Word of what had happened at Outpost Calder was already spreading further out into the wider coalition, becoming one more small story added to a growing pile of similar ones. Stories about a species called humanity that seemed to have a habit of sitting down next to the exact things everyone else had been taught to run from, and simply refusing to leave. Cinder shifted in her sleep, pressing closer against him, and Daniel stayed exactly where he was, in no hurry to be anywhere else.